Okay, so we were talking about different types of bias, and we were talking specifically about the different types of response bias in the last video. So the third type of response bias is the wording of questions. So the way a question is worded can affect the answer. So they must always be asked in balanced form and should be specific. Or the way that we've worded the question can result in bias. So for example, if we look at this first example, which question do we think is worded better? Do you oppose the reduction of estate taxes, or do you favor or oppose the reduction of estate taxes? Well, we should say that the second one is worded better. And the reason is because it's balanced. How do we know it's balanced? Because we give both options. You can favor or you can oppose. Those are opposite responses. The first option, it only asks us if we oppose it. Okay, what about in the second example? Do you think the United States should forbid public speeches against democracy? Or do you think the U.S. should allow public speeches against democracy? Well, in this one, neither one is balanced, because in one, it's asking about forbidding, and the other, it's asking about allowing. The interesting thing is when they actually ask these questions to people, the first question resulted in 21.4% saying yes, the U.S. should forbid public speech against democracy. When they asked the second question, 47.8% of people answered no. So the difference between these two, of course, is the forbid or allow. So you can see saying yes to the first question is equivalent to saying no to the second question, and look at the difference in the numbers just based on which word choice they used. Okay, let's look at number 3. How much do you study versus how many hours do you study statistics each week? In this one, the second option is again better, and that's because it's more precise. The precision comes because instead of saying how much do you study, it says how many hours, so it gives us units that the response should be in, and it's specifically asking for a certain topic that we study each week. And you notice we've confined it to a week instead of being just a general, how much do you study? Okay, another type of response bias is the ordering of the questions or the words within the questions. So many surveys rearrange the order of the questions within a survey or the word choice within questions so that previous questions do not affect the responses. So, for example, do you think the U.S. should let communist newspaper reporters from other countries come here and send back to their papers the news as they see it. Versus, do you think a communist country such as Russia should let American newspaper reporters come in and send back to America the news as they see it? So if in this example, they're asking every survey respondent both of these questions. But when they order them so that they ask the first question, then the second question, then number one gets 54.7% yes, and number two gets 63.7% yes. When they order them the other way, so when they ask the second question before they ask the first question, then they get, for question number one, even though it was asked second, 74.6% say yes. And for the second question, which was actually asked first, they get 81.9% yes. So here you can see that the order in which they ask the questions affects the percentage of people that answer a certain way. So that's why if they ask half the people that in order first question then second question, and the other half second question then first question, then they can average out the responses. Okay, another way to do this, and there should not be an A in there. Do you approve or disapprove, and it says rotated, of the job the current president is doing? So by rotating, the effects of the word location in the sentence is removed. So they'll ask some respondents, do you approve or disapprove? And other respondents, they will ask, do you disapprove or approve? And so a lot of times, since our brains work in a linear fashion, the first word we hear is like, oh, yes. So if we rotate the approve and disapprove, then the effects of the word location in the sentence are minimized. Okay. I will try to finish this up in this video. Hopefully I can make it. So, another type of response bias is the type of question. So should the question be what we call open, or should it be what we call closed? So open questions allow the respondents to choose their own response, while a closed question requires the respondent to choose from a predetermined list of responses. So if you choose to have an open question, that would be like, what are your favorite TV shows? There's no constraints there. You can pick anything you want. You need to make sure that you phrase the questions so that you get similar responses. Otherwise, you could have so many different responses that it's kind of useless. So for a closed question, that would be like, which of the following TV shows is your favorite? And then I would list maybe 5 or 6 TV shows. And you have to pick one from the list. So if you choose one of those, a closed question, you need to make sure that you rearrange the possible responses for each person taking the survey. And that's because a lot of us, when we're confronted with a list, we'll just look at the first 2 or 3 of them and ignore the rest of them. So if we rearrange the possible responses, then that prevents everybody from picking the same response because it's high up on the list. Closed questions also make our results easier to analyze because we've confined them to a smaller number of possible answers. The problem with closed questions is the correct response for a respondent may not be listed. And I encounter this all the time because it amuses me to take surveys. So I do fill out a lot of surveys that people put up on SurveyMonkey. And a lot of them are like about new products and naming them. And they'll give me a list of names and ask me which one I like best. And I think most of them are horrible, but there's no way to tell them that in the survey. So that's the problem with the closed questions. Okay, so most survey designers recommend doing pre-test surveys using open questions. And then you choose the most popular responses from the open questions to create closed questions for when you do the actual survey. So, of course, the goal is to limit the number of choices in a closed question without forcing respondents to choose an option they do not prefer, because that will create response bias. So there's a whole other type of bias that can happen, that it's not technically a response bias, but it will lead to a bias in your sample, and that's data entry error. And so obviously, if I'm entering people's data and I enter the wrong thing, that changes my results. So that's something else that we need to watch out for. So now we need to discuss non-sampling versus sampling errors. So a non-sampling error results from either undercoverage of a segment of the population, non-response bias, remember that's where people don't respond, but the people who don't respond have a different perspective than the people who do. Response bias, or data entry error.